So, Mission 3. We know that on Mission 1, George Washington delivers this message from Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia telling the French to leave. We know what happens there, and the French say no. He delivers the letter home. He gets sent on Mission 2. Mission 2, of course, you know because we've studied it. On Mission 2, George Washington is ordered to go to the forks of the Ohio and fortify the region and help the guys finish Fort Prince George. What he doesn't know is that the French showed up, took it over, and built Fort Duquesne in its place. So he backs up to the Great Meadows, hears from Half King that the French are there to attack him, and starts the French and Indian War. That 15-minute firefight at Jumonville Glen may have started the first global war. He backs up, builds Fort Necessity, and you know what happens at Fort Necessity. George Washington made a bunch of mistakes, the rain shows up, and Washington loses. He goes back to Virginia and quits the military because he is so distraught with his major loss. All right, what you're looking at right now is Fort Duquesne. Everybody should be familiar with this. This is at the forks of the Ohio. This is what it would have looked like. Now, obviously, this is a model, but Fort Duquesne has to go. In class, I kind of compared it to the Death Star in the Star Wars movies. You know, the big, bad, nasty base that must go. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of French soldiers and Indian allies were here because they knew that the British were after this area. So, of course, they're going to stack their soldiers at Fort Duquesne. To take out Fort Duquesne, they imported this guy. Now, you read a little bit about this. This is General Braddock. General Braddock was from Scotland. He was in his 60s. He was an old guy that didn't want to take any advice from anyone else. That's going to be part of his downfall. One of the things he does is he had Native Americans lined up to help him. He calls them savages to their face, obviously a racist old white guy, and he doesn't have any Native Americans helping him out. And according to him, he doesn't need it. Now, when they sent for him from Scotland and brought him over to Virginia, his objective was to capture Fort Duquesne and build a road so that you could get people and equipment back and forth to the forks of the Ohio from Virginia. Problem was, General Braddock had barely any fighting experience at all, and any fighting experience that he did have was fought on a big, wide open field like I showed you in class, where the soldiers on one side line up in rows and columns. They get the order to fire at the same time because their muskets were so inaccurate. And guys like Braddock, the people in charge, were all the way at the back watching and giving orders. So he was never really in any danger. He's not used to fighting in the North American woods. And that's all North America was at this point, were woods. Now, he builds an army of over 2,000 men and others. In the reading that we talked about, and I talked about this in class the other day, some of the others there were slaves to help carry things, there were servants to make the army supply, there were nurses, there were cooks, mostly females, there were wagons and horses and cows and ammo and black powder and uniforms. It was like a moving city. So whenever I say over 2,000 men plus others, there were upwards of close to 2,800 human beings walking through the woods, building this road, being led by General Braddock. Now, it's no secret that George Washington goes with him. Even though he was retired, he quit the army, he is asked to go as an aide-de-camp. That means a helper for General Braddock. And it makes sense that Washington goes because he's been here multiple times before. He knows where a lot of the places are. He knows how to get to Fort Duquesne because he's been there. So Washington is going to go, but he's just kind of like an advisor giving some advice. Now, in March of 1755, General Braddock lands in Virginia. He quickly moves to Cumberland, Maryland, where he starts to train his troops to fight in wide open battlefields. Again, another part of his objective was to build a road. They had to cut down ancient trees by hand using axes and saws and hatchets. Then the stumps needed to come out too so that the wagons and the animals and everyone else could get through. So he starts to build this road roughly 11 to 12 feet wide for hundreds and hundreds of miles. He starts building it in Winchester, Virginia, and slowly works his way to where we are right now. If you go to certain places in western Pennsylvania and Maryland, you could still see leftover portions of General Braddock's road. Now, they're kept this way. It was 250 plus years ago, so obviously that would have grown in, but the people that own these properties are keeping them clear so that people could see what General Braddock's road would have looked like back in the day. Now, when he was originally given his orders to get to the forks of the Ohio, Fort Duquesne, He was told that he only had 13 to 15 miles of mountains to get over, when in actuality he had between 50 and 60 miles of mountains and trees and forests to cut his way through to get to Fort Duquesne. So these guys are moving extremely slow, with no Native Americans helping him out pretty much anywhere. Now, if you zoom in, you can see that the southern road here is Braddock's Road. As soon as he crosses into Pennsylvania, which is spring into summer of 1755, one of the first places they camp at is the Great Meadows, where Fort Necessity used to be. Washington writes in his journal, not a whole lot about this, but that they are camped out where he had one of the worst encounters of his life, which is going to be the Great Meadows. They're going to camp out here and they're going to keep moving north. Now you can see a place on this map, it's called Dunbar's Camp. John Dunbar was one of the officers marching with the British. He was a soldier. He was one of the guys in charge. And he lived in this area. Today we call this place Uniontown. And it was a farm is what it was. Whenever they get to Dunbar's Camp, they're going to camp there. The men are going to go ahead and clean themselves up. They're going to take a little bit of a breather, but they're going to stop at John Dunbar's place where Uniontown is today. You can see it on the map. Again, another shot of what Braddock's Road would have looked like. This is a preserved part. This was taken back in the 1940s or 50s, but there are certain parts of the road today, if you know where you're going, that you could see that, yeah, that is actually a road. Now today, where John Dunbar's camp was, you can read on the little sign here, General Braddock decided that he didn't need almost 3,000 people to march all the way to Fort Duquesne. So he makes an incredibly bad decision. He's going to break his army in half. He's only going to take half with him to Fort Duquesne to continue building the road. The other half will wait at John Dunbar's camp and work on the road that they had built already, all the way back to Virginia. So he's going to split his army. He's going to carry on building the road and try and take out the French. That is a huge, huge, huge mistake. Today, John Dunbar's camp is a Christian camp known as Jamonville. Yes, it's named after the man who was murdered and de-brained about 2 or 3 miles away from here. Today it is a Christian day camp. Here's another shot of the cross at night. If you drive on Route 40 and you look up at the top of the hill in Uniontown, you can see this cross at the very top of the hill. Here's a shot from the 1860s when cameras were invented of John Dunbar's camp. This is as close as I can get you to actually seeing what Dunbar's house and his camp and his farm look like. So picture hundreds and hundreds of men and women and slaves and servants sprinkled all throughout this area trying to work on the road going back to Virginia, while General Braddock and the other half of his men were on their way to Fort Duquesne. Eventually, they get closer and closer to our area, guys, girls. They go through Connellsville. They get even closer. They go through Westmoreland County, Elizabeth, and then they start to head into our area. This is right across the river from us. You can see that White Oak is right in the middle. This is White Oak, PA. And if you look in the bottom right-hand corner where the red line is coming through, when Braddock built his road, they stayed on top of the ridges. They stayed on top of the mountains because, as you know, it's always better to be on high ground than low ground. Obviously, none of these buildings and roads and houses were there back in 1755, but they're going to come right through Jack's Run Road. If you look kind of in the middle where the red line breaks, they're going to come right over the hill, right by the Wendy's and the Dairy Queen, and there's a Rose's department store there in White Oak with the Taco Bell. Oak Park Mall, I believe, is what they call it. They're going to come right through there, and they're going to continue going towards McKeesport. Now, eventually, they're going to get to McKeesport. This is Walnut Street. Again, I have it highlighted with the red arrows here. On July 7th, they're going to cross the Monongahela River for the first time. It's pretty close to where the Duquesne-McKeesport Bridge is. If you look in the top right-hand corner of this picture, you can see the Duquesne-McKeesport Bridge. Now, instead of hugging River Road, which wasn't built yet, they climbed a little bit higher up the hill. If you go halfway up Center Street in Duquesne and you continue through Duquesne about that far up the hill, you will eventually hook up with what is South 2nd Street. Today, South 2nd Street and 2nd Street in Duquesne, that is the road that Braddock's men are believed to have followed. So again, here's another shot. They came right down Walnut Street. They're going to cross right at the Duquesne-McKeesport Bridge. They're going to work their way up the hill and then go towards Kennywood. They're going to keep on cutting the trees down and moving and moving and moving. If you know where the McDonald's is and everything like that, they're going to come right through where the McDonald's is. And they're going to camp where Kennywood is. So the first crossing of the Monongahela, Robert Griffin outlined it and painted it for us here. We looked at this painting a couple of weeks ago. Those are the British crossing the Mon for the first time. And if you remember, and I've told you a couple of times, the rivers weren't very deep back then. There were no barges or anything like that. They weren't very deep. They were only 2 or 3 feet deep. So the men were able to easily walk across the Mon River. So now they're on our side of the river. They're on the West Mifflin, Whitaker, Duquesne side of the river, and they're heading towards Kennywood. Now, obviously, Kennywood was not Kennywood back then. It was just a place that Christopher Gist saw, that Washington saw, was a good place to camp if they needed to. There was a lot of cover. It overlooked the river so that you could see your enemies if you needed to. And it had a lot of big, ancient white oak trees with massive leaves that would serve as good cover in case it rained or anything like that. There was also a freshwater stream in the middle of Kennywood that is still there today. His men camped in and around this area. If you look at the next slide, which is one of everybody's favorite rides ever, the Jackrabbit, everybody's familiar with the double dip, all right? Whenever you go down the double dip, the next time you're on it, look down and you will see a tiny little creek at the bottom of the hill. This area, this gully, is where General Braddock and his men are going to camp. They're going to camp on July 8th into July 9th. Now again, whenever camps did camp, whenever they left, they just left everything there. So I would bet money that there are a lot of artifacts in and around this part of Kennywood that no one ever dug up. Now, if you go to Kennywood today, I know the log jammer's not there anymore, but you can see the sign. The very same sign is outside of Kennywood, right across from McDonald's. And it talks about how July 9th, General Braddock is going to cross the Mon River and he's going to get ambushed. That's where we're going next. So everybody knows where the dam is. If you've ever been on the train, you know where the dam is. And then, of course, on the left-hand side of this picture, you have Edgar Thomson's steel mill. All right, that's still there and it's still working today. But if you look on the right side of the dam where the train tracks are, there is a sort of level place off of Kennywood that the British are going to wake up in the morning on July 9th. They're going to cross the river again to the mill side, and they're going to start to make a left to go towards Fort Duquesne. At this point, they're where the town of Braddock is today, and they're only about 7 or 8 miles away from Fort Duquesne. General Braddock probably would have reached Fort Duquesne the next day or two, and if he would have gotten that far, they would have had a battle. But as you're going to see, it's not going to work out that way. Now remember, there's nothing here anymore. There was no dam in 1755. There's no mill in 1755. There's no Kennywood in 1755. It's an ancient forest. The rivers were here, but everything else was forested. So they cross, and they're cutting their way through the forest, and you can see it's outlined here with the red and the blue. They're going to get to right about where the dark arrow is. Today, this is where General Braddock Towers is. And you're talking over 1,000 men are going to be cutting their way through the woods when all of a sudden they stop. The French and Indians appear in front of them. They were startled, the British were. They backed up, and that's when the firefight started. You can see the 2 arrows on the top and the bottom of where these guys are. Native Americans and French hid behind the trees, and whenever the French were right in front of them, they opened fire and just started lighting these guys up, killing people instantly. The men didn't know where to go or what to do because most of the leaders had been shot at this point. General Braddock, a couple hours into the battle, is going to be shot too through the chest. He's not going to die right away. He will die of his wounds a little while later. But it is an absolute ambush, and it is chaos. Men turned around and tried to run backwards and ran right into the rest of their army. Some of the men in the back tried to go up the hill towards where the golf course is. Native Americans were waiting up there to ambush them. A lot of men ran down to the river on the British side to escape the Native Americans and escape the French. A lot of the Native Americans chased them down with tomahawks and gave them a tomahawk to the head at this point. So there were a lot of brutal fighting and a lot of brutal murders going on. Now, this ambush, picture this. You're in the middle of an ancient forest. It's dark because of all the cover. You're getting hit by people that you can't see. There's smoke everywhere. There's people screaming. There's loud explosions from the musket fire and everything else. Eventually, the British are just firing into the crowd, shooting some of their own guys at this point. Some men were just falling down in the fetal position, not knowing what to do, being murdered by Indians and French at this point. So it is absolutely chaotic. This is one of my favorite portraits. If you zoom in, you can pause me anytime you want, but if you zoom in, you can see that this is what Braddock would have looked like back in the day. An ancient forest completely covered by trees, no buildings anywhere, a nice big steep hill going all the way up to today's golf course. This is what it would have looked like. Imagine being in the middle of this. What would you have done? You probably would have just balled yourself up and cried on the ground and then got killed. Now, Braddock is shot, like I told you. He takes a shot right through the chest. Now, George Washington, who was sick, he had a temperature, he had a fever, he probably had the flu. He was riding in back of this long wagon train of soldiers in a wagon because he was sick. And whenever he heard the first shots, he quickly got up, got dressed, jumped on a horse, and rode to the front of where the chaos was. That's where he found numerous officers down. That's where he found General Braddock shot lying on the ground. Now, Washington, if you remember, was just a helper. He wasn't even in the military at this point. But his instincts kicked in. He went and gathered up as many men as he could and tried to lead a retreat. Now, the first horse was shot out from underneath George Washington. He flies off the horse. He's unharmed. He picks up another riderless horse, jumps on that, and continues to gather troops. The second horse is shot out from underneath him. After about an hour and a half, he manages to gather some semblance to this group and makes people go back the way they came. So he was the one that sort of organized this. For about 4.5 to 5 hours, there's nothing but chaos in the middle of the woods where Braddock is today. So the city is named after the general who was shot. Now, this portrait tells you exactly where the fighting began. If you look in the background, you could see a yellow brick building with some green on it and some windows. That's General Braddock Tower. It's still there today. You can see it if you ever go to Braddock. This is where the heaviest fighting was. On the left-hand side is the Little League ball field. But this painting shows you what it would have looked like back in the day in 1755. If you go to the Carnegie Library of Braddock, this plaque is on there talking about how this is Braddock's battlefield. Now, you can read this on your own. These are various people in the painting who were there to help General Braddock. General Braddock is the guy leaning up against a tree. Can you figure out which one is George Washington? Okay, good. George Washington is the guy leaning up against a tree next to General Braddock with his knee on the ground. He's giving orders, telling people what to do. You can see that it's chaos around him. People don't know what's going on. Washington was the only one that was able to keep his head at this point. So he gives orders to other people to load up General Braddock into a wagon and send him back the way they came towards Fort Necessity. Again, here's General Braddock Tower. You've probably seen this building before. This is where the French and the British ran into each other. This is where the major fighting first took place. And of course, there are signs everywhere in Braddock. Whenever you're in Braddock, you probably don't pay any attention to it. But if you look, there are statues, there are signs talking about what actually happened there. It was an absolute massacre, guys, girls. Absolute massacre. All right. Whenever they built the mills back over 100 years ago, they did find lots of artifacts, leftover wagons, skeletons of men, skeletons of animals, lots of ammunition, guns, stuff that the Army just dropped and left whenever they were leading the retreat with George Washington and General Braddock. This is what it would have looked like. Now, Braddock was very much alive whenever he was on this wagon. Of course, 3.5 days later, he is going to die. Now, Washington knew that General Braddock was an important guy and he just couldn't leave his body there. So what he ended up doing was a very important gesture. He dug a hole in the middle of the road that he built, the very same road that General Braddock and all these men are building. He dug a hole, had General Braddock dressed in his best uniform, wrapped him in a kind of like a silk shroud, said a few words out of the Bible. You can see him reading here, and they buried General Braddock in the road, in the very same road that he had built. And then they buried the dirt on top of him, and Washington, who was kind of now in charge, has all of the men and the wagons and everything that were left march over General Braddock's grave so that they smashed it into the ground and made it look like the rest of the road. It sounds rude, but it's very smart. And it worked. The Native Americans and French never found General Braddock's body. They didn't find his body until 1913, whenever they started to build the national road through Uniontown. They were digging. They found a body. They called some university professors in to see if they could identify. They found the gold cufflinks, They found the uniform. It was still intact. They found the skeleton of General Braddock. Now, after the battle, like I said, there were artifacts everywhere. I mean, you could probably still go down there, guys, girls, and find artifacts everywhere. These are some that are in the museum that are down in Braddock today. You have anything from nails to chains to padlocks, parts that you would use to ride a horse, parts of a saddle. Again, you could pause this and zoom in, check out some of the stuff that they did find. A lot of it was never found, which means it's out there today somewhere. You get a metal detector and go to the right place, you could probably find some stuff. And as always, I will give you 20 bucks if you bring it in, if it's authentic. You can see lots of belt buckles at the top too. That's what those little squares are. Those are belt buckles. Every couple of years they reenact it, like they're burying General Braddock in the road. That's what you're seeing here. Now, if you look on the top left, that's where General Braddock is today. Originally, if you follow this path, which is the direction of General Braddock's road, you will find this grave. This is where General Braddock was originally buried. This is where they dug the hole. This is where Washington you just saw it on one of the slides. He read a few words out of the Bible. This was where Braddock was buried. And they found him in 1913. Decided to give him a proper burial at the top of the hill, and this is where General Braddock is today. And again, you can pause this, read it. It was dedicated by the Coldstream Guards, which was the name of the regiment that he was in charge of. So that's what happened to General Braddock. They didn't take out Fort Duquesne. He should have listened to the people that were going to help him, but he didn't. And this is what you have. So make sure that you take adequate notes on this. Make sure that you have this in your notebook, and this is what you need to know.